Okay, in retrospect, I realize it would have been more fun to call this section Great Expectations in keeping with the theme of classic novels, but I didn't, so whatever. Expectations it is. So let's just take a quick recap of where we've been and where we're going here in terms of our outside-in development. We're trying to write expectations that drive the development of our code. So we already showed a simple example of that in the controller method. And we discovered that even when we have to collaborate with other methods and other classes, even if those methods don't technically exist, we can set up expectations around them and essentially create a stub that is going to be called and satisfy the property of my controller code did what it should do. So the idea, which we're now going to see other examples of, is that we're trying to break a dependency between the thing that we're testing and other things that it depends on or works with, generally called its collaborators. And the key weapon in our arsenal to fight this is a seam, which is a way that you can affect the app's behavior without editing the source code of the app. So if we continue our example, we said, well, what should the controller method do when it receives the search form? Well, we said it should call a method that we haven't written yet that will call TMDB and search for the movie. The good news is we got that to pass. Notice that we got it to pass by doing minimal work. Okay, we didn't actually write the method. We just verified that if the method existed, the controller action would have called it. So let's move on to the next bit, which is less trivial, that says, assuming that a match is found, it should select a new view called search results, which we haven't created yet, in order to display the matches that it found. So what would we do with that? And we're going to keep concentrating on the happy path here. Step 3 is a sad path step, but we're still working on the happy path. So it should select the search results view to display the match. What does that actually mean in practice? Well, it really means two separate things. One thing is, it should decide that the correct template to use for rendering is the search results template. And remember, in the last segment, I created an empty view for the search results. It doesn't have anything in it. It was just an empty HAML file so that there would be some view that could be rendered at the end of that action. Now, you might think in this case, well, the whole idea that by the end of a controller action, you're going to look for a view and it has a certain name and stuff, isn't that just a built-in part of Rails? Why would you write a test case for something that is supposed to just be part of the framework? And indeed, that would be correct. But you'll also remember that even in our simple rotten potatoes example from a couple of lectures ago, sometimes the action doesn't finish by rendering its own view. Sometimes it finishes by redirecting you to someplace else. So it's easy to imagine an action that if it succeeds, it renders a certain view. But if it fails, or depending on what else might go wrong, it might render a different view, or it might redirect to another action. So the idea that part of what you're testing in a controller method is, does it end up by doing the right thing, right? That's a legitimate thing to want to test. In this case, because we're only talking about the happy path right now, the happy path is it does whatever Rails would normally do, which is to look for a view. So we don't need to belabor the point that it's going to call or it's going to select the correct template, because we'd just be testing the framework. But the reason to understand how these kinds of tests work is in your own apps, it's usually much more complicated, right? The controller action, depending on what happens during its execution, may choose one of a couple of different templates to render. The second thing we're saying is that assuming that that template does exist, then a list of what the matching movies were should be available to that template so that it can display them to the user in some way, right? That's the whole goal of this, was to try to find matching movies in TMDB. So this is really two different specs. And we could take the same approach we did before. Each spec can get its own it block. And we're going to see what expectation constructs we can use. Just like we use should receive to express the concept that it should call a certain method in another class, we're going to now use a new expectation construct called should, which is basically, it's based on the concept of a matcher. I'm going to have an object, and I'm going to establish that some property should be true about that object. There's a number of built-in properties that I can check. And again, if you looked at the homework that comes with its own test cases, simple properties are like the object should equal something, right? If the object is a string, you can compare it to another string. If the object is a number, you can see if it's greater than or less than some other number. So those are kind of simple examples of an object having a property. But as we'll see, objects can have many other interesting properties as well. And you can define your own custom matchers. Just like as you're writing your Cucumber tests, you define a domain language that makes sense for your app. As you'll see, when you're writing your functional and unit tests in RSpec, you can make your own matchers that correspond to the models and controllers that are in your app. And overall, that makes your test cases less cumbersome to write. So let's take a look at the example of should and should not. The idea is that a matcher applies a certain test to the receiver. And there's a number of examples that we can look, some of which have already appeared in the homework. So a simple one is we have this object count. We could say count should equal 5. So what is should actually doing? It's looking at this object, and it's applying the result of this block to the object, right? So it's basically sending count the equals message with 5 as an argument. And we also saw an example early on about if we use syntactic sugar and leaving out parens and desugaring things like this call to less than, we can write 5 should be less than 7, which really is punctuated this way. 5 should be odd. How does that work? Well, one of the conventions in RSpec is that if the matching condition begins with BE underscore, it will look for a method name odd question mark that can be called on the original receiver. So basically, in this case, it's calling the odd question mark method on 5 and expecting that the result of that will be true. Right? And this is another sort of a nice use of method missing, because it allows you to write test cases that sort of express in quasi-stilted programmer English what you're actually expecting to happen. For those of you around the world, feel free to use quasi-stilted programmer, national language of your choice. Mine's English. We can also say things like result should include. Now, who handles the call to include? Well, as we saw, include is one of the many methods given to you in the enumerable module. So a reasonable assumption is that the programmer expects that result is something that mixes in enumerable or else defines include on itself, right? But again, it's going to call include question mark on whatever the receiver is. I felt in the spirit of the government shutdown, I had to include an example like this. This could be syntactically legal, right? If in fact my application involved the concept of modeling relationships and cooperation, I could define my own custom RSpec matcher that can be applied to a receiver and that can take an argument and do whatever testing it needs to do to check my definition of cooperate with. And in that case, the matcher will be called. By the way, it'll probably fail in this case. I'm sorry to be so cynical, but it is what it is. But the idea is that just as, rather than expressing some underlying condition that would be tested by this, I can create a cooperates with matcher that encapsulates all that logic. And why would I do that? Because now the intention of the test is self-describing. I can just look at the code that's in the test case and infer what the developer meant to do. What's the thing that they're actually trying to establish is true about these objects. And some of these simpler forms up here, if you look through the homework specs, you'll see examples of all of these. There's also a should not, which inverts the sense of the test. As we'll see, there's also additional matchers that RSpec adds where you're using it with Rails specifically. So there's a few basic ones, like these top ones up here. These are just part of the basic RSpec core. But there are also matchers, one of which we're going to see in a moment, that are there just to make life easier if you're doing a Rails development specifically. And the first one of those we're going to see is this one. Result should render template. Right? So what does this mean? It means that when if you call a controller action, the result of calling that controller action is it's saying it should find and select a template called search TMDB and attempt to render that template. It doesn't actually matter if we've created the template or not, right? Again, the only thing we're concerned about here is whether the controller is doing its job, so we only care about whether the controller decides to make the right choice. Whether the rendering happens correctly, well, that's sort of up to the view subsystem, right? That's outside the scope of this particular test. We're just checking that the controller action does what it's supposed to do. So after we do our post search TMDB, we can look at the response method, which is another nice RSpec add-on that comes when you install RSpec for Rails, which returns the controller's response object. The response object is the thing that encapsulates what is it that I am about to do to deliver the response to this request. And one of the things that you can call on the response object is render template. That's what the render template matcher is intended to use. OK, so now we've expanded. Here's the first spec that we developed in the previous lecture segment. And the only thing we're checking here is that it calls the model method, right? Here, we're checking an additional thing, which is that it should select the search results template for rendering. So what am I doing here? What is this stub thing? Well, this is confusing. Up here, I said movie should receive find in TMDB. I'm asserting that it would be an error if that method did not get called. Down here, stub is actually just a way of saying, if somebody tries to call this method, just don't do anything. Just don't return nil, don't check the arguments, just don't give an error. Just ignore it, pretend it never happened. So why is it that in this test, it's OK for me to do that, whereas in the previous test, I was adamant that if it's not done, that would be an error? Well, again, I'm exaggerating a little bit to prove a pedagogical point here, which is that each test case, each spec, which is an it block, should be testing exactly one thing. The idea that we're testing that it should call the model method, well, we already did that. This test is responsible for that. In this test, we're checking that it selects the search results template for rendering. So even though we know, in scare quotes, that it really does need to call find in TMDB, technically this test doesn't care about that fact. This test only cares about this line here, which is that once we get a successful response, the response should indicate that we're going to render the right template. Okay? Again, I'm nitpicking about what we have to check versus what we don't have to check in each individual test, but the underlying concept is an important one, which is you want to focus each test on one behavior. Tests are cheap. You're going to have thousands of them, even for a simple app, so don't combine multiple checks for different kinds of behaviors into the same test. Okay, so that's what it looks like. Now, at this case, the view at least has to exist as an empty file. It doesn't have to do anything in it. And because the view has to at least be, we have to have a placeholder for it, which we already created, that's the reason that we think of a controller test as a functional test. Because when you think about it, when we did that simulated post from within the test, that's exercising the route subsystem, because it's got to figure out how to map the route to an action. It's exercising the subsystem that takes the data and makes it available in params, which arguably is part of Rails, but still it has to get exercised. Because the controller claims to call a model, it exercises enough of the controller method to make sure that something else is going to get called. And it exercises the controller's ability to figure out which view is going to be rendered. So it's actually not just a unit test, right? It actually touches more than just the lines of code in the controller action. So we think of it as a functional test, a test that tests a couple of modules, goes across a couple of boundaries, but is still generally quite limited in scope as to what is being tested. And this lets us add another thing that we know how to do in tests. We already knew should receive. Now we have this idea that an object should match some condition. And there's some basic conditions that are built into RSpec, but there's also some Rails-specific ones, like the idea that there's a response object on which you can match conditions like render template. And that allows us to get to the point where we can ask another question, after which I'll do a fun thing. So which of these looks like it might be a not valid use of should or should not? We could say something like result should not be empty. We could say 5 should be spaceship result. Result should not match this regular expression. Or is it the case that these are all reasonable? These are all valid uses of calling should or should not. Should and should not are interchangeable for the purposes of this question.